For more than a century, millions of sincere people around the globe have accepted that invitation. They opened their front doors on quiet Saturday mornings, listened to two politely dressed strangers, and accepted the promise of an earthly paradise where death, sorrow, and injustice would be wiped away forever. They gave up careers. They handed over their life savings. They surrendered their critical thinking, trusting that the 8 or 9 men sitting at the head of this movement were speaking directly for God. Now shift the scene. You are no longer in a sunlit garden in New York. You are sitting in an Australian government hearing room. On screen, a high-ranking member of that exact same leadership council is under oath. He is being interrogated by a relentless prosecutor about why his organization kept internal files on over 1,000 alleged predators, and why not a single one was ever reported to the police. Instead of showing grief, instead of offering comfort to the victims who sat in the gallery with tears streaming down their faces, this leader sat beneath the sterile lights of a video deposition and suggested that allegations of institutional failure were merely malicious lies manufactured by religious enemies. That single moment did not just damage the credibility of one man, it shattered the sacred illusion. It exposed the cold, mechanical reality of an untouchable system, an institution designed to protect its own power, its own reputation, and its own real estate portfolio, no matter how many human lives are shattered in the process. The crisis you see today did not begin in that courtroom. It did not begin with modern internet leaks. It began more than 50 years ago with a secret council, a catastrophic prophecy that ruined thousands of families, and one man sitting at the highest table of the religion who made the fatal mistake of asking a question he was never supposed to ask. This is the story of the architecture of absolute control. This is the story of the man they tried to erase, and the system that will rewrite reality itself before it ever admits it was wrong. To understand why this system operates the way it does, you have to travel back to 1966. Inside the closed offices of the Watchtower Society in Brooklyn, New York, the leadership released a book containing a detailed chronological calculation. According to their proprietary interpretation of biblical history, 6,000 years of human existence on Earth would officially reach its conclusion in the autumn of 1975. The message delivered to the global membership was not ambiguous. The end of this current global order was not just coming soon, it had a specific expiration date. Through the late 1960s and early 1970s, the organizational publications dialed up the psychological pressure to an unprecedented level. In official print, they commended young couples who chose not to have children because the time left was so short. They openly praised members who sold their homes, liquidated their businesses, and moved to rural areas to preach full-time during the final months of human history. Teenagers were told that pursuing a university degree was not only a waste of time, but a sign of weak faith. Why study for a career in a world that wouldn't exist 5 years from now? Tens of thousands of everyday believers trusted the men at the top. They made life-altering, irreversible decisions. They cashed in retirement accounts. They postponed necessary medical procedures. They walked away from lifelong careers. They staked their entire financial, emotional, and physical existence on a single year. Then October 1975 arrived. The leaves turned, the weather cooled, the winter came and went, and the world kept turning. The catastrophic silence from headquarters in Brooklyn was deafening. There were no global broadcasts apologizing to the families who had bankrupted themselves. There was no emergency relief fund established for the elderly believers who had given away their life savings. Instead, the leadership did something that established the psychological blueprint for the next half-century. They blamed the victims. Articles began to trickle down through the congregation, subtly scolding the membership for being too eager. The leaders claimed that the members had allowed their imaginations to run wild, completely ignoring the fact that headquarters had authored, printed, and distributed millions of magazines, deliberately cultivating that very hysteria. Thousands of devastated members quietly walked away into the night, their faith destroyed and their finances in ruins. But the most dangerous rupture was not happening in the congregations across America and Europe. The real rupture was happening behind the executive doors of Bethel itself. Sitting directly at that executive conference table was Raymond Franz. Raymond Franz was not an internet critic. He was not a bitter outsider looking through the window. He was religious royalty. His uncle Frederick Franz was the movement's chief theologian, the intellectual engine behind its most complicated doctrines, and the man who would eventually become the 4th president of the Watchtower Society. Raymond had dedicated every breath of his existence to this movement. He had lived through disease and deep poverty as a missionary in the Caribbean. He had traveled the world representing the leadership, and in 1971 he was elevated to the highest governing council on earth, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. He was one of a dozen men who held absolute spiritual authority over millions of people. As a sitting governing body member, Franz was granted total access to the internal archives. He was assigned to lead a research project to compile an exhaustive biblical encyclopedia for the organization. But the deeper Franz dug into the historical data, the more his world began to crack. He discovered that the historical dates the organization used to anchor its cornerstone doctrine, the claim that Christ's invisible presence began in the year 1914, could not be reconciled with actual historical and archaeological evidence. He watched as major doctrinal policies were decided not through profound spiritual revelation, but through arbitrary internal debates and two-thirds majority votes, where board members traded compromises like politicians in a backroom deal. And when the 1975 failure tore through the worldwide membership, Franz watched his fellow council members refuse to take accountability. He saw sincere men and women expelled from their communities simply for asking honest questions about the failed dates. Franz realized he was trapped inside a machine that prioritized its own corporate survival over truth itself. He started asking the forbidden question in the executive boardroom. If we were wrong about the dates, and if we are willing to let our own people suffer the consequences to protect our pride, what else are we wrong about? In an authoritarian system, doubt is not treated as a human struggle. Doubt is treated as treason. In May 1980, the governing body moved against Raymond, France. He was summoned to appear before an internal judicial council. There were no public records, there was no independent legal representation, there was no presumption of innocence. The crime: France had dared to write a private letter expressing personal compassion to a former missionary who had been excommunicated. In that private correspondence, he questioned whether the organization's harsh disciplinary policies were truly aligned with the teachings of Christ. Think about that. A man who had spent 40 years building an international religious empire was put on trial for writing a private letter of basic human empathy. The leadership interrogated France for hours. They searched for any legal technicality to remove him immediately. Unable to secure the necessary consensus on the spot, they issued a cold ultimatum: resign quietly or face complete public destruction. On May 22, 1980, Raymond France submitted his resignation from the governing body, but his quiet exit was not enough to satisfy the machine. By late 1981, through a series of newly engineered disciplinary policies specifically designed to trap him, Raymond France was formally disfellowshipped. The punishment was absolute social execution. Under the organization's mandatory shunning rules, every friend he had made over 40 years, his colleagues and his family members were ordered to treat him as if he were physically dead. If a lifelong friend so much as said hello to him on the street, that friend would be hauled before a committee and threatened with the exact same fate. Time magazine covered the story, calling it an unprecedented purge within one of the world's most secretive religious groups. The leadership in Brooklyn assumed that by cutting France off from his social network, he would fade into obscurity and be forgotten. They severely underestimated him. In 1983, Raymond France published Crisis of Conscience. It was the most devastating, meticulously documented insider account of a religious high council ever brought to light. France did not write with fury or bitterness. He wrote with the methodical precision of an archivist. He reproduced internal voting sheets, confidential memorandums, and transcripts of secret meetings. He laid bare the reality that the men claiming to be God's sole channel on earth were frequently operating in confusion, political infighting, and deliberate historical revisionism. The headquarters immediately banned the book under penalty of instant expulsion. Members were warned that reading France's words was a mortal spiritual danger. They tried to burn the memory of Raymond France out of their history books. But while an organization can control its internal library, it cannot control the outside world forever. Fast forward 35 years. The setting changes from a private boardroom in Brooklyn to the highest levels of the Australian legal system. In 2015, the Australian Royal Commission launched a massive government-backed inquiry into institutional responses to child safeguarding failures. When the Royal Commission turned its focus to the Watchtower Society, in an investigation known formally as Case Study 29, they uncovered a reality that horrified the public. Using official subpoena powers, government investigators gained access to the organization's confidential branch archives. What they found inside those filing cabinets shocked even veteran child protection advocates. Over a period of several decades, the Australian branch had documented files regarding more than 1,000 alleged perpetrators of severe offenses against minors within their congregations. The number of those files that the organization voluntarily reported to the secular police, 0. When the Australian government demanded answers, they did not just question local congregation elders. They issued a summons for a sitting member of the governing body, Geoffrey Jackson. Jackson testified via video link under solemn oath. For the first time in modern history, the public got to watch an active member of this untouchable council cross-examined by a skilled legal interrogator. The performance was stunning. When senior counsel Angus Stewart asked Jackson directly whether the governing body viewed themselves as the exclusive spokesman for God on the entire planet, Jackson hesitated. He looked down, shifted in his seat, and replied, "That I think would seem to be quite presumptuous to say." Millions of followers watching that live stream around the world froze in disbelief. From the Kingdom Hall platforms, these men demanded total, unquestioning loyalty because they claimed to be God's sole representatives. Yet here, under the pressure of legal perjury in a secular courtroom, a leader backed down and called that very foundational claim presumptuous. It got worse. Jackson was pressed on the organization's rigid enforcement of the ancient two-witness rule. Under this organizational policy, church leaders are instructed not to take internal disciplinary action against an accused individual unless there are two independent eyewitnesses to the exact same act, or the perpetrator makes a full confession. The prosecutor pointed out the obvious common-sense reality. Clandestine crimes against vulnerable individuals almost never happen in front of an audience. Applying this ancient rule to modern safeguarding issues meant that allegations were systematically dismissed internally as unsubstantiated, leaving predators free to remain in congregations without secular authorities ever being notified. Jackson defended the policy. He sat under oath and argued that the organization could not change its scriptural standards, even if secular laws and child safety advocates pleaded for reform. The Royal Commission's final report was unequivocal. The organization's policies had fundamentally failed to protect the vulnerable, actively shielded perpetrators from legal accountability, and prioritized the public reputation of the institution over human safety. The blueprint exposed by Raymond, France in 1980 was now confirmed on an international legal record. The system protects the system, no matter the human collateral damage. In the years following the Australian inquiry, the governing body attempted a major public relations transformation. They moved their headquarters to a secure, secluded campus in Warwick, New York. They launched their own proprietary streaming network. The leaders stepped out from behind the curtain and made themselves the international public faces of the religion. Among them, one man stood out above the rest, Anthony Morris III. Morris was the enforcer. He was the unapologetic, hardline voice of the platform. In global broadcast after global broadcast, he delivered scathing lectures. He told parents not to send their children to college. He condemned fashionable clothing. He gave graphic descriptions of how non-believers would be destroyed in the upcoming divine war, infamously blowing out a match on camera to illustrate how billions of human lives would vanish like smoke. He was the face of absolute, uncompromising dogma. Then the internet intervened. First came unverified consumer footage that caught Morris on a Sunday morning at a retail store miles away from headquarters, loading a shopping cart with thousands of dollars worth of premium top-shelf liquor, an image that caused massive cognitive dissonance for millions of impoverished followers who were constantly told to live lives of extreme frugality and self-sacrifice. Then in February 2023, the organization's official website posted an abrupt single-sentence notice. Anthony Morris III is no longer serving as a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. No explanation, no farewell video, no expression of thanks for decades of international service. Within days, the organization began scrubbing him from their digital servers. Morning worship programs featuring Morris were taken down or quietly re-edited with his segments removed. Just like Raymond, France 40 years earlier, a man who had claimed divine guidance one day was erased from the institutional record the next. The followers were given a simple, unspoken directive: do not ask why, do not look into it, move on. By late 2023, the compounding pressure was reaching an unsustainable boiling point. The internet had rendered historical suppression impossible. Former members were connecting online, comparing internal documents and sharing government court records. European governments were beginning to challenge the organization's charitable status over human rights concerns regarding mandatory shunning. Long-standing teachings regarding the generation that saw 1914 were continually being stretched beyond recognition. How did the leadership respond to this unprecedented crisis of trust? At the annual meeting in October 2023, the governing body delivered a statement that shocked even their most seasoned observers. Speaking from the platform, the leadership officially declared that the governing body does not need to apologize for making mistakes in doctrine, interpretation, or organizational policy throughout their history. Listen carefully to the logic they presented. They acknowledged that they are neither inspired by God nor infallible, but instead of taking responsibility for the decades of catastrophic fallout caused by their erroneous mandates, they shifted the ultimate blame onto the divine. They argued that when their teachings are proven wrong, it is simply because the spiritual light is unfolding progressively. Therefore, their past errors were not human miscalculations or institutional arrogance. They were part of God's divine timetable to test the faith and loyalty of the believers. Think about the psychological construction of that argument. If the leadership makes a rule that turns out to be beneficial, it proves they are guided by God. If the leadership makes a disastrous mandate that destroys families, bankrupts believers, or leaves the vulnerable unprotected, it also proves they are guided by God, because the disaster was simply a divine test to see if the members would remain unconditionally obedient to the leadership anyway. It is a completely closed psychological loop. The leadership claims absolute authority but accepts zero accountability. They demand unconditional obedience but assume zero liability for the results of that obedience. If a follower questions an error, the follower is labeled an apostate. If the leader makes an error, it is excused as progressive illumination. When you look at this 50-year timeline, you realize a fundamental truth. This is not a story about a few rogue individuals. Raymond, Franz, Geoffrey Jackson, and Anthony Morris are not three isolated cases. They are the predictable products of an engineered institutional structure. The architecture relies entirely on a three-phase mechanism. Phase 1. Claim absolute divine backing to enforce total behavioral and intellectual conformity. Phase 2. When reality, history, or secular courts prove those claims wrong, alter the narrative, adjust the policies overnight, and declare that the light is getting brighter. Phase 3. Immediately isolate, defame, and shun anyone who points out the contradiction between Phase 1 and Phase 2. This is why the system cannot change. This is why the system will never offer an apology. To apologize would mean admitting that the authority they claimed over human lives was never absolute in the first place. For decades, the high-walled compound could survive because it held a monopoly on information. If a member had doubts, there was nowhere to go. If a leader was purged, his name was simply erased from the books and forgotten. That monopoly is dead. Today, the transcripts of the Australian Royal Commission are permanent, unchangeable public records. The historical documentation preserved by Raymond, France sits on millions of digital devices around the world. The video archives of retracted doctrines and deleted leaders are available to anyone with a smartphone. Every single week, men and women who have spent 30, 40, or 50 years inside this organization sit quietly in their seats at local congregation halls. They look up at the platform, they look at the screens, and they feel the sudden, undeniable realization of what they are actually part of. They are realizing that the organization they were told was a direct line to the divine is, and always has been, an insular human hierarchy fighting for its own survival. The governing body has built an empire of certainty, but when certainty is exposed as an illusion, all that remains is conscience. And as history has proven, once a human conscience wakes up, no institutional wall is strong enough to keep it locked inside.